Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the scientific studies you read are as solid as they seem? Well, this new research dives deep into that very question, specifically for studies that use computer simulations to test ideas. Imagine this: science is all about building reliable knowledge. But what happens when the very tools we use to test ideas, like computer simulations, might have their own hidden problems? This study looked at how psychologists use simulations, if they report everything honestly, and if we can really trust the conclusions from these complex computer experiments. So, the big picture here is the current replication crisis in psychology. You might have heard about it. It basically means some studies couldn't be repeated, shaking our confidence in certain findings. While a lot of attention has gone to studies with real people, this research zooms in on simulation studies. These are super important because they help us understand how different math methods work under controlled conditions without real-world messiness. They often lead to highly influential papers. But the researchers in this study noticed that the way these simulations are reported and checked for honesty hasn't gotten much attention during this whole replication crisis. The researchers behind this paper were concerned because even decades ago, people were saying we need better ways to report simulation studies. They worried that maybe, just maybe, these simulation studies aren't as robust or trustworthy as we'd like them to be because of how they're reported and shared. They suspect that just like in studies with people, there might be questionable research practices or QRPs happening here too. Think of it like this: if you are trying to show your new computer method is the best, you might be tempted to only show the results that make it look good, or hide the ones that don't. To figure this out, the researchers sent out a questionnaire to people who wrote simulation studies that were published recently. In 2023 or 2024, they wanted to know about their reporting habits, if they followed open science practices, and how trustworthy they thought simulation studies in their field actually were. Open science, by the way, is all about being transparent, sharing your data and code, and making your research easy for others to check. So what did they find? Well, it is pretty interesting. When it comes to reporting, more than half of the simulation studies, about 50.2%, showed some form of selective reporting. This means they either left out some details about the simulation conditions, the methods they used, or the results they measured, or they buried them in extra online materials instead of putting them right in the main paper. They often did this to make the paper easier to read or to focus on what they thought were the most important results, sometimes because of journal requirements. Another important finding is about things like non-convergence. Basically, when the computer simulation didn't quite finish properly and missing data. About 39% of studies didn't report these issues at all. For simulations, not reporting these things can significantly change the results. So it is a big deal. The main reasons for not reporting these problems were often that the researchers thought they just didn't happen in their simulations. Or many simply hadn't thought about reporting them, or they weren't familiar with concepts like Monte Carlo standard errors or MEXCs, which are important for understanding the uncertainty in simulation results. Now, let's talk about open science. The good news is that a large majority, over 75%, of authors said they shared all the code needed to get the same results. That is great for transparency. However, things like providing clear instructions on how to use the code, or having someone else independently check if the code actually works, were much less common. Only about 40% provided code instruction, and a mere 20% had their code checked by someone else. These are crucial steps for making sure a simulation is truly reproducible. When it came to using specific research guidelines, especially ones designed for simulation studies, it was super rare. Most researchers said they didn't use any guidelines, often because they didn't even know they existed, or they didn't think they were necessary, or it just wasn't something people typically did in their field. Pre-registration, which is like writing down your plan before you start, was also very uncommon. Perhaps one of the most surprising findings is how researchers themselves view these studies. When asked to estimate the trustworthiness of typical simulation studies in their field, they gave it a pretty high score, about 0.74. They also thought simulation studies were generally computationally reproducible, giving that a score of 0.64. And fairly complete in their reporting with a score of 0.55, this suggests that while there are some issues, researchers still have a good deal of faith in the simulation studies in their area. Now, it is important to talk about limitations. The researchers themselves point out that these findings are based on what people told them in a survey. People might not always be perfectly honest or even fully aware of their own biases. They suggest that their numbers might be a bit too optimistic compared to what a more in-depth review of the actual papers might show. For instance, Their reported rates for things like selective reporting and code sharing are a bit higher than what some previous studies that just reviewed papers found. So, what does this all mean? The study highlights that while simulation studies are vital, there is definitely room for improvement in how they're reported and shared. The authors recommend that journals should start pushing for better reporting standards, like specific guidelines for simulations, and that they should actively check for the availability of code. They also suggest that researchers should not only share their code, but also make sure it is understandable and runnable by others, perhaps even having it independently checked. The idea of pre-registration is a bit tricky for simulation studies, especially when researchers are developing brand new methods. It is often a more exploratory process where they're trying things out and refining their approach. However, for studies that are more about comparing existing methods, pre-registration could be a really useful tool. The fact that researchers feel simulation studies are generally trustworthy is interesting, especially given the ongoing replication crisis in other areas of psychology. It might be that people believe simulations, being controlled environments, are less prone to certain biases. However, this high level of trust might also be contributing to why new practices aren't being adopted faster, as people might feel the current system is good enough. Ultimately, this research is a really important step in understanding the landscape of simulation studies in psychology. It is not about saying all simulation research is bad, but rather about shining a light on areas where we can all do better to ensure the foundations of our scientific knowledge are as strong and reliable as possible. What are your thoughts on these findings? Do you think simulation studies are generally trustworthy? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more breakdowns of fascinating science. See you next time.